Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to viewers from around the world. I'm Tom Countryman. I'm the chairman of the board of directors of the Arms Control Association, and I want to welcome you to this seminar by the Arms Control Association on the topic of nuclear testing. All of the seminars that we conduct are important, and I hope you will attend others. This one is particularly timely. For all of the 21st century, only one country has performed explosive nuclear testing, that is North Korea. The other 8 states that are in possession of nuclear weapons have observed and agreed moratorium on the testing of nuclear weapons. The Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, negotiated in the 1990s, has not yet entered into force, in part because key states, including North Korea, China, and the United States, have not ratified the treaty yet. Still, the continuation of the moratorium has been an important contribution to the goal of preventing proliferation of nuclear weapons and is a basis for the hoped for future agreements on arms control and disarmament among the nuclear weapon states. So it was a shock 3 weeks ago for the United States President, Mr. Trump, to say in a Truth Social posting that the United States intends to resume nuclear weapons testing. And he directed the Department of Defense, or as he says, the Department of War, to prepare for this testing. Now, the confusion in Mr. Trump's initial statement has led many of us to wonder, what exactly is he getting at? His accusation that China, Russia, and even Pakistan have conducted nuclear testing is not borne out by any publicly available information. And we have seen the Secretary of Energy and the head of the National Nuclear Security Administration try to state that, in fact, the U.S. will continue the subcritical, the zero fission yield tests that the United States has undertaken since it instituted a moratorium on testing in 1992. That distinction is important between critical and subcritical, and we'll explore it here. There are a number of financial and legal and political obstacles to the stated intent to resume testing at the Nevada National Security Site, and we will explore those obstacles as well. I am delighted to have a couple of experts who know better than anyone else what the technical and political realities are. We will hear first from the representative for Las Vegas in the U.S. House of Representatives, Dina Titus. There are not many members of the House of Representatives who have written a book, and there are even fewer in the House of Representatives who understand nuclear weapons. Representative Titus is at that very small intersection. She has written a book about nuclear weapons, and I recommend to you her book about testing in the Nevada test site called Bombs in the Backyard. After Congresswoman Titus speaks, we will hear from Corey Hinderstein, former senior official at the National Nuclear Security Administration, now a vice president at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, who can address many of these key technical questions. And finally, for additional analysis, I'll turn to Daryl Kimball, the executive director of the Arms Control Association, to give further perspective on what the U.S. may or may not do and how the world would react. So with that introduction, it is my great pleasure to hand the microphone to Representative Titus. Let me also note before you begin, Congresswoman, those of you who are participating, you can ask a question of any of our panelists by using the Q&A function in your Zoom link. Thank you for being here, Representative Titus.
Well, thank you very much, Tom, for that gracious introduction. And thank you to the association for hosting this seminar. Our panelists are certainly the experts in the field, and it's great to have so many in the audience who are interested in this topic. It shows you just how important and timely that it is. As you said, I'm Dina Titus. I represent District 1 in Southern Nevada. My district stretches from the Las Vegas Strip all the way out to Boulder Dam. So it is definitely in the heart of where this will have a great impact. As you say, I spent my career as a professor of political science at UNLV, then a Nevada state senator, and now as a member of Congress. And throughout that entire time, the main thread of my interest academically and politically has been Nevada's nuclear legacy. Whether it's been fighting against Yucca Mountain, the waste storage project, or pushing for some reasonable, sane nuclear weapons policy, it's an issue that I'm passionate about. I appreciate you plugging the book. Thank you very much. I would just say that the title, excuse me, Bombs in the Backyard. You also don't want them in your backyard, but that comes from a statement by Truman, who said, "We don't want to scare people blowing up bombs in their backyard." And he made this statement when they decided to move out of the South Pacific from testing to the continental United States. They did that in the early 50s because it was too far away, it was too expensive, and it couldn't be secured as well in the Pacific as it could closer to home. In January 1951, just to give you a little historical perspective, the first bomb was shot off at Frenchman's Flat in Nevada. This is the first atmospheric nuclear test. It was codenamed Able. You had A, B, and C. It was a 1 kiloton bomb. It was shot from a cannon on a nearby mountaintop. Now, that test was followed by over 900 more tests, 100 atmospheric, and then 800 that moved underground that continued throughout the Cold War. Now, when the atmospheric tests were conducted, you saw mushroom clouds on the horizon over the desert, and it kind of became a tourist attraction for people visiting Las Vegas at a time of a shot. You could see the naivete of dealing with something that was so dangerous. It actually became a big part of our popular culture. Women got atomic mushroom cloud hairdos. We had a Miss Atomic Bomb beauty pageant, and we had the civil defense giving advice to people like wear sunglasses when you look at the blast and don't stand next to a big pane glass window. That's how we dealt with it on the local level. Now, these tests had a number of different purposes: the impact of the weapons on the environment, determining the strength of the weapons that we could develop, what was the impact on military equipment, what were some possible peaceful uses of the bomb, like the Sedan crater, for example, and then just proof testing existing weapons. And then kind of down the list of things to look at was the impact of radioactive fallout. Now, you can imagine this had some pretty big impact on the people who lived downwind and also on soldiers who were part of the war games during some of these tests to see how you would react in the field to a detonation. You know, the cancers developed, other diseases, they're nearly ubiquitous in this population, especially with veterans. You also had the test site workers who were there, who were exposed and developed certain cancers. And that's why we introduced and finally passed the RECA Compensation Act. Too little, too late, really, but at least it was something. I've also introduced the PRESUME Act, and this is to prevent the VA from requiring so much information about certain dosages before you can become eligible for any benefits. We call this a presumptive cause, and if you can count that rather than relying on epidemiological evidence, then you have a better chance to receive some kind of benefit. So these cold warriors were very much a part of what was going on at the test site too. Even when you transition to underground testing, and that was a big argument, you'll no longer have the radioactive fallout, there were still problems because some of those underground tests vented and out came the radioactive contaminants into the air and into the water, which are problems we're still dealing with today. There's still traces of plutonium and uranium in the drinking water, and they'll be there for no telling how many thousand of years. We know that if there is this push, as the president has announced, to restart testing, there's only one place that it can go, and that would be at the old test site, the old proving ground, now the security site here in southern Nevada, just 60 miles north of Las Vegas. And so we realized that not only would this create a geopolitical crisis with an arms race in the offing, but it would also have real public health ramifications. Now, you may remember in 2020, the first Trump administration called for a resumption of testing. Back then, I led a charge in the FY21 NDAA to be sure that that was prohibited. We thought things were fairly resolved, but as you know, the more things change, the more they stay the same. If you'll pardon my Southern French, it's plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. Now, on October 29th this year, as you mentioned, Tom, the president announced that he was directing the Department of Defense to resume nuclear testing. This is a disastrous policy reversal. We don't really know what he meant by it. Like everything that comes out of the White House, there's very little detail initially. But we do know it came out of that 2025 proposal. If you look on page 399, you can see that Project 2025 calls for a rejection of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. So not only would we see testing at home, but I think it would give the green light to countries around the world, other nuclear powers, to do just the same. And that would put us on a collision course. We're already seeing this with Russia and China. It would encourage proliferation of nuclear weapons with countries to develop them, and with countries that have them to test them, and it put the health of Nevadans in jeopardy once again. Now, this also blows apart our whole non-proliferation treaties and policies and practices since 1992. Now, we know it's a fact because we've seen Putin has already said and directed his forces to prepare for the resumption of nuclear testing. And the Washington Post just reported that China is also rapidly expanding and modernizing its infrastructure for a nuclear testing site. As you also said, there is no technical, no national security, and no political reason to resume explosive nuclear testing. If we do that, we are abandoning what we have stood for, fought for, and negotiated for all these many years. And so we will see the development of more weapons, more sophisticated weapons, and the U.S. will lose the edge it has in this technology without any question. We already do the subcritical tests. Scientists are already involved if they haven't been fired like so many have, or rift recently, but they can do these subcritical tests. I think Corey's going to talk about the details of how those work, and we appreciate that, but it does not have a nuclear explosion, no self-sustaining nuclear chain reaction, but computer modeling that may be even more reliable than shooting off a bomb. But we know that details and nuance don't really matter much to this president. We are hearing that some members of the cabinet and the Defense Department are advising him that this is not a good idea, but that doesn't necessarily mean anything. After the announcement was made, I've introduced more legislation calling the Restraint Act that would prohibit the use of any federal funds for the resumption of testing. And so we will try to get bipartisan support for that. We will try to get that passed. There are many ways to do that. The standalone bill, adding it to the NDAA, looking for some other vehicle to hang it on. We have especially support from John Garamendi from California and Senator Ed Markey, and we really appreciate that. The NDAA should be coming up in December 1st, so we'll look at that. Now, all this is as we are looking at other treaties expiring that are coming up. The START treaty that was going to be expiring very shortly. And so the timing is such that something needs to be done. And let me just conclude by saying it's not just me saying this, it's not just the scientists, but the public is on our side on this. Polling shows that 75% of people support continuing the moratorium, including 72% of Republicans and 80% of Democrats. In Nevada, 73% of voters oppose it, and the majority, 53%, say they strongly oppose it. So this announcement is not only bad policy, but it's also bad politics without public support. So I hope I can work with you all as we move forward to try to get this passed in one form or another and put a stop to rolling back what has been such an important part of our foreign policy for several decades. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. Thank you very much for an overview of the reality on the ground and under the ground in Nevada. And I think we'll have some additional questions for you. I want to remind listeners that you can use the Q&A function. I've already received a couple of good questions that we will get to before the end of the hour. Let me turn now to Corey Hinderstein to address some of the technical issues, including what do we test now? Is there a need for additional testing? Could we even do additional testing rapidly? Corey?
Thanks, Tom. Appreciate your introduction, and thank you so much to Congresswoman Titus for kicking us off with important perspective from Nevada, and on behalf of the people of Nevada. And of course, thank you to Daryl and ACA for putting together this webinar. I'm going to cover three basic topics in just a few minutes, and then obviously we can come back to any of them in the Q&A and the discussion. But I want to talk about the technical requirements for testing, the technical capability that we have for different kinds of nuclear testing, and then what some of the options are going forward. And with that, I think that will be a good transition point to what Daryl will talk about. First, let's talk about technical requirements. I think that one of the first things that I would expect people to ask in the wake of the president's comments would be, is something happening that would mean that we'd have to revisit the moratorium on underground nuclear testing? Is there a need to do that in order to maintain the U.S. nuclear arsenal and deterrent in a way that is safe, secure, effective, and reliable, which is, of course, the responsibility that we have. As long as we have nuclear weapons, we want to make sure that they are effective for both deterring our adversaries and assuring our partners and allies. And so the short answer I would give is no. There is no reason to resume underground nuclear testing. And that comes from a number of sources. It's not just because I think testing is a bad idea. I do think testing is a bad idea and has a lot of downstream consequences that we'll talk about. But it's especially a bad idea if we don't need to do it. So every year, the directors of the three nuclear weapons laboratories, that's Los Alamos, Livermore, and Sandia, they are required to send a letter to the president through the Secretary of Energy where they put their personal name, scientific judgment, and reputation on the line. It's not on behalf of the institution. It's their personal letter where they are asserting whether or not they still have confidence in the nuclear weapons, in the deterrent, without nuclear testing. This letter is required to go directly in their words. It cannot be edited or modified. And they have provided that letter through multiple generations of lab directors, through multiple changes of posture with our nuclear weapons, including currently through a modernization phase. Every year, all three have provided that letter. Now, if they were to say something different, then I think it would be important that we be having a broader conversation about what the needs would be to resolve any questions that they might have. The the key here is nothing has changed and they still have confidence. Why do they have confidence? This is part of the bigger picture. When we, as a country, decided to approach a moratorium on underground nuclear testing, which, by the way, happened before the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty was concluded. This was a decision that the United States made independently before there was a treaty binding it. At that time, we said we're not just going to go away from nuclear testing and not do anything else. We launched what was then called the Stockpile Stewardship and Management Program that has been a multi-billion-dollar investment in the science and technology base of the national laboratories so that they can make this assurance, so that the lab directors can write this letter and feel like they have all of the relevant information. And that includes things like the facilities at Los Alamos. There's the DART facility. There are a lot of these like big machines that are designed to simulate different parts of the nuclear explosion. A couple of them I want to call out in particular. One is the NIF facility, the National Ignition Facility. A lot of people might have noticed when there was a big announcement, but that for the first time ever on the planet, we had achieved fusion ignition, where we had achieved an experiment where more fusion energy came out than the energy that was put in to drive it. That was a huge breakthrough. And a lot of people looked at that and said, this is our path to fusion energy, unlimited clean energy. And I very much hope it is. I think the NIF can contribute to that conversation. But the fact of the matter is NIF is not a nuclear energy experiment. It's a facility that was designed, built, and maintained to model and simulate what happens at the key moments of fusion in a nuclear weapon so that we can have confidence, again, in our modeling, simulation, and codes that support that stockpile assessment. The other thing I want to mention is the subcritical experimental capability. And Congressman Titus noted this. There is a facility underground at Nevada called the Pulse facility. It used to be called U1A, and some of us still fall back on that every now and then. But it not only is capable of, but is in the process of being enhanced. I use that word specifically through a program called the Enhanced Capability for Subcritical Experiments Program, ECSE. And it's designed to be able to do these kinds of experiments long into the future, to answer the kinds of questions that we think might come up as our stockpile ages and as we introduce some modernized components into that stockpile. So I think that the United States has no intention of moving away from the kinds of science, technology, and physical experiments, right? Those subcritical experiments underground at Nevada, they involve high explosives and plutonium, but they are designed so that they don't sustain a self-sustaining chain reaction. They are designed so that they cannot, and that's been the focus of that program, and I think that program remains extremely important. So what can we do going forward in the wake of these comments from the president? I think there are a couple of options. One is really the status quo. And when I say status quo, that's not resting on our laurels. Status quo includes putting this investment into these capabilities and continuing to have a robust stockpile surveillance program so that if any issue were to come up, we would be able to identify it and design a plan to understand what the consequences of those technical issues would be. The status quo includes a political commitment, a moratorium on full-scale underground nuclear testing that, by the way, has most recently been reasserted not just under the Biden administration, but under President Trump's nuclear posture review in 2018. The status quo includes maintaining the U.S. advantage that we have. The status quo means that we have locked in a situation where we have the most nuclear tests under our belts, where we have all the data from that and all the data that can stream into our advanced modeling and simulation. The reason Russia and China would just be salivating for us to restart nuclear testing is so that they could too, because they want to catch up with us on the amount of data we have. And we are in the best position right now, and we lose by allowing others to catch up. Now, what else could we do? What would go beyond some of the status quo? If the president is really concerned that, as the State Department has noted for quite a while in their compliance reports, that there is a possibility that Russia and or China are conducting these very small yield tests, these tests that are similar to subcritical experiments, but they cross the line for just a moment and have a little bit of self-sustaining chain reaction before it fizzles out. If we're worried that they're doing that, the answer is not for us to do it too. The answer is for us to ask for more confidence in what they're doing. And there are ways to do that. We have technical measures and political measures to increase our knowledge about what Russia and China are doing. And it has been said, and I don't dismiss it entirely, that they do have questions about what we're doing underground. I mentioned this ECSE project. I mentioned subcritical experiments. They do see a lot of activity at our former nuclear test site. They see people going underground and, going into tunnels and doing things. So if they have questions, we should be able to respond to those too. But it's important we don't do that in a voluntary, kind of non reciprocal way. I think the ask we should have is that we increase reciprocal transparency. And if they're not willing to do that, we should call them out on it, because we talk a lot about what we're doing and they don't talk a lot about what they're doing. And I think we need to put them on that equal footing. So there are a lot of options as to what's going forward. We know that senior officials are having debates about how to respond to the president's comments, whether we can respond. He said he wanted to be on equal footing with Russia and China. That could relate to nuclear delivery system testing, which of course we're doing as well, without the warheads associated. Of course, that could include an announcement of expanded subcritical experiments. It could also include the call for either these very short-lived, low-yield experiments or full-scale nuclear testing. But in my mind, it's really important that we distinguish that either of those steps, those last steps, would violate our moratorium and would violate our asserted limits around the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty that we're holding others responsible for as well. And so the political consequences would be much bigger than the technical ones at that point. And I think that's where I will stop, because I know Daryl is going to talk about, how the rest of the world might react to any actions that we take. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you very much, Corey. Let's go now to Daryl Kimball, Executive Director of the Arms Control Association, to talk about the implications of a resumption of nuclear testing for both non-proliferation and arms control in the world. Daryl?
Thanks so much, Tom. Thank you very much, Corey, Congresswoman Titus. Thanks everyone for being here. So let me just start answering that question by reminding everybody why the global moratorium on nuclear test explosions is important, and what is accomplished, and why a resumption of U.S. nuclear weapons testing would be a tremendous shock to the system that would, as Congresswoman Titus put it, blow apart the nonproliferation system. As was mentioned earlier, the United States ended nuclear weapons test explosions at the Nevada test site in September of 1992. That was the result of a congressionally mandated moratorium on nuclear test explosions that had a great deal of public support. It was a bipartisan legislation. The next year, President Bill Clinton had to decide whether to extend the moratorium or not. He decided to extend it and to pursue negotiations on the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, which was concluded in September of 1996. Since the treaty has been established, there has been effectively a global taboo on nuclear testing. As Corey said, no country has conducted a large-scale nuclear test explosion in this century except for North Korea, and their last test was in 2017. In addition to that, we have 187 countries who have signed the treaty, which means that each of them are legally obligated under the Vienna Convention on Treaties not to take any action that is contrary to the object or purpose of the treaty, which is to not to conduct nuclear weapon test explosions. Now, what is a nuclear weapon test explosion? As Corey alluded to, there is a definition. The 5 nuclear armed countries that are party to the CTBT are in agreement about what that definition is. Contrary to myth, there is clear understanding about this. There is a fact sheet that's available on the State Department website that defines what the P5 or describes what the P5 understanding of the scope of the treaty is. And it is to prohibit any experiment that involves a self-sustained chain reaction. And this is an important point because it relates to perhaps what it is that President Trump is concerned about when he says that we will match other countries' nuclear testing activities. Let me also mention that the United States, of course, has not ratified the treaty. There was a brief debate, highly partisan debate in October of 1999. The Senate did not approve the ratification of the treaty. Nevertheless, Republican and Democratic administrations ever since then have upheld the U.S. moratorium on nuclear test explosions and encouraged other countries to observe the global nuclear test moratorium. And in September of 2016, the United States advanced and won UN Security Council support for the first ever and thus far only UN Security Council resolution specifically about the CTBT and the nuclear test moratorium. And it reaffirmed the P5 support for the eventual entry into force of the CTBT and support for the nuclear test moratorium. So there is a taboo against nuclear testing that has been established. So if President Trump is serious about resuming nuclear explosive testing of some kind and can overcome what would be very substantial congressional opposition to the resumption of nuclear testing, to the bipartisan opposition for the resumption of nuclear testing in the state of Nevada. We heard Dina Titus mention public opinion is against it. I would also note that the Nevada state legislature approved unanimously bipartisan resolution in May of 2025 in support of the continuation of the U.S. nuclear test moratorium. So if he directs his team to implement a strategy that involves nuclear test explosions, this would have massive domestic political ramifications, but international ramifications. And it is clear that Russia, which has vowed to mirror U.S. nuclear policy, would resume nuclear testing of some kind at its Novaya Zemlya nuclear test site. Such testing probably, in my view, would not provide the Russians with much military or technical value, given that the Russians have conducted 715 nuclear test explosions. Yet they would do this for symbolic and emotional reasons. And that would also open the door for North Korea, which has only conducted 6 nuclear test explosions, to resume doing so. These would not be low-yield nuclear test explosions by North Korea. These would be large-scale nuclear tests. And this definitely would assist Kim Jong-un in developing and his scientists developing lighter, more compact nuclear warhead designs, the kind that you need to arm a long-range ballistic missile with, the kind that could reach the continental United States. So it is very much in our interest not to open the door for either Russian or North Korean nuclear testing. And then I think there are some questions about how China might respond. China has, in recent days, in response to President Trump's comments, expressed its support for the global test moratorium, asked for clarification about his comments, but they too may consider resuming nuclear testing if the US and Russia also do. We also have to remember that there are other countries that have conducted nuclear tests and stopped because of the global taboo. India and Pakistan had a brief exchange of nuclear test explosions in May of 1998. Even though neither have signed the CTBT, they each have vowed not to conduct a nuclear test explosion. But in India, there is a simmering debate about whether the small number of nuclear tests that were conducted by India's scientists are sufficient to provide the technical data they want for developing more sophisticated long-range weapons that can carry lighter and smaller types of more sophisticated warheads. So we could see India also begin to resume nuclear testing. So this chain reaction of nuclear testing, I predict, would happen if the United States opens the door after 33 years to resume nuclear testing. This would obviously add to the already high level of nuclear risk we possess today, we see today. It would also create massive stress on the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty, the 1968 treaty that binds the nuclear armed states to engage in good faith negotiations to end the arms race and to negotiate on disarmament. The CTBT was specifically mentioned in the preamble of the treaty in 1968. And the conclusion of the negotiations on the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty in 1996 was a key promise that the nuclear weapon states made when the treaty was up for not just a review, but a decision about whether to extend it indefinitely. So this action, if the United States follows through on this, would have massive implications for the global nonproliferation regime. Let me just mention a couple of other things that have been mentioned, go into slightly more detail before I wrap up and we go to questions. Despite the fact that the CTBT has 187 signatories, despite the fact that there is now a global international monitoring system established to detect and deter cheating, that system does not yet include the option for short notice on-site inspections because the treaty has not yet entered into force. That means that the United States, China, and Russia, each of which have former test sites where they're doing active work related to nuclear weapons, they each have the technical potential to conduct very low yields, but supercritical nuclear explosions that would violate the prohibition established by the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, but would be very difficult to detect by the existing global international monitoring system. It's just simply too difficult for them to detect explosions that produce at most pounds of yield, explosive yield, that are being conducted in a small containment chamber or a small room deep underground. So there is a latent risk that one of these three states who have the technical capability to conduct these kinds of low yield nuclear explosions might be doing so. As Corey mentioned, the U.S. intelligence community in 2019 assessed that Russia may be conducting such experiments at the Novaya Zemlya test site. When pressed, General Robert Ashley, then the head of the DIA, was asked, are they doing this, or do you think they're capable of doing this? He had to admit that we assessed that they are capable of doing this and did not assert that the Russians were actively conducting these kinds of supercritical activities. And as Corey mentioned, there is a solution that's available if there is greater leadership from the United States and a dialogue with Russia and China over this lingering issue. Corey's boss in 2023, Jill Ruby, then the administrator of the National Nuclear Security Administration, proposed a three-way technical conversation between the US, Russia, and China on measures to help assure each country that none of them are conducting supercritical experiments. And work has been done to figure out how this could be measured, how this could be verified. I'm pretty confident that the technical capability is there, but the technical discussions have not yet taken place. So if the Trump administration in the end is concerned that this is what's happening and this is what Donald Trump is thinking about, rather than, as Corey argued against, and I would agree, mimicking bad behavior and opening the door to any and all kinds of nuclear testing, low yield and larger yield, the better course of action would be to try to re-engage with Russia and China on a technical level, to come up with confidence-building measures, voluntary measures ahead of the entry into force of the treaty in order to assure each side that these activities are not going on. That said, regardless of that, the other technical reality is that this very low yield testing has very little technical or military value for either the United States, Russia, or China. And I would just note that the National Academy of Sciences has produced two very detailed technical reports in 2002 and one in 2012. And they concluded that hydronuclear testing, these low-yield nuclear test explosions, have limited value in validating the design of unboosted fission weapons with a yield of less than 10 tons. In other words, very simple bombs of the type that neither the United States, Russia, or China plan to or want to induct into their arsenal. So, in other words, if Donald Trump wants to resume nuclear testing on the basis that the Russians or the Chinese might be doing these kinds of experiments, it doesn't provide the U.S. with any value. If the Russians and the Chinese are doing this, which would be very bad and should be criticized, it's not providing for them military value that changes the nuclear balance of terror between these countries. So, as Corey said, we need to encourage the White House and Congress to ask some hard questions, to consider the deep and profound ramifications of reversing bipartisan U.S. policy not to conduct nuclear test explosions. We need to clarify for the world what President Trump meant. I would just finally note that, I mean, our organization has been receiving inquiries from governments, allies and adversaries alike, about what the president meant. I can only go so far in trying to interpret his words. It makes me uncomfortable that I'm trying to answer these questions instead of senior officials at the State Department, Energy Department, or White House. So let me conclude there. Let me thank everyone, and let's invite questions to clarify issues.
Thank you very much, Daryl. I have a number of excellent questions from the audience on a range of topics. I'll ask first those that are most directly related to today's topic. And let me start with a question from a colleague, Igor Naimushin, who is a correspondent for the Russian news agency, RIA Novosti. I'll ask first Congresswoman Titus, and then Daryl if he has a further comment. Does the Congress have meaningful tools that could prevent the resumption of explosive testing? And then asks a somewhat related question: how is Congress feeling about the expiration of New START and the possibility of extending limits, given that that treaty expires in just 76 days? Congresswoman, would you like to take those two? Let me ask all panelists to be brief because, as I said, we have a lot of excellent questions.
Well, under ordinary circumstances, we would have some powers, but always in foreign policy, Congress is second fiddle to the executive. And that's because the executive is able to control information and have access to things that are top secret that we don't necessarily have access to as a member of Congress. What we have now, you could try to re-up the effort on the test ban treaty, but you know how difficult it is to get a treaty, even in the best of times, 2/3 of the Senate. And right now, I don't see that happening. We can also push to extend the New START treaty, which is coming up, expired here in just a couple of months. But we're hearing some rumblings that that might be tied to Ukraine, be part of the deal there, even because Putin has said he's willing to talk about it. And that would certainly make Ukraine's situation worse. So I'm not sure that's a real possibility. Legislation, like I have introduced, is another vehicle. And then funding is the big one. So if we can stop the funding, then you could have some opportunity to stop any resumption of the testing. I say that trying to speak as a political scientist, how it would work in the best of ordinary times. Those aren't ordinary times now. And anything that you try to get through Congress is really with the Democrats and the minority in both houses, and the Republicans just subject to whatever the current whim of the president is, will be very difficult.
Okay. Thank you. Daryl, do you want to comment further on the two questions?
Yeah, just very briefly. I mean, I would highlight regarding Congress's ability to block any proposal to resume nuclear explosive testing. Congresswoman Titus's Restrain Act, I think that's the acronym you're using, which would prohibit such a resumption of nuclear testing. That is gaining support. That's been introduced just days after the president's comments. I think that's the most direct and relevant thing right now. Regarding the New START treaty, it will expire in about 74 days, February 5, 2026. No talks are underway, but President Putin proposed on September 22nd that the United States and Russia continue to respect the central limits of the treaty, 1,550 deployed strategic warheads, for another year to provide time to negotiate other measures on their strategic and other parts of the nuclear arsenals. President Trump said, when asked by a reporter, I think that's a good idea, but there has been no formal agreement between the two sides so far. That is the important next step forward. That can be accomplished, according to my sources in Russia, separately from any understanding regarding what does or doesn't happen regarding Russia's war on Ukraine. So that is another important issue. It's a problem that the president needs to address. And Congress, I think, has not had enough of a conversation about this, but I think there is strong Democratic support for re-engagement with Russia on this and extending the New START limits for another year. Members of the Republican Party, I think, would likely support the president if he decided to extend those limits and support engagement with Russia on strategic arms control. But the president needs to take those actions now.
Okay.
Can I add real quickly, Tom? You mentioned that there's not been enough engagement in the Congress, and that's true. There haven't been any hearings, and I imagine most of my colleagues really aren't tracking this so much. It did come up a little in some of the nomination hearings for the head of Stratcom, asking about his position on the testing, and so that's been about the extent of the conversation, other than trying to get people on board our legislation.
Yeah. Let me ask Corey a question that has perhaps a short answer. You mentioned that you described the process of subcritical testing, which includes, of course, the use of radioactive materials. Is there a concern about contamination and spread of radiation in such testing?
Sure. Thank you, Tom. And I do appreciate the question, especially because, the legacy of nuclear testing in Nevada and other parts of the country is real, and we need to take that extremely seriously. In this case, while I would never say that the risk of anything is zero, I've been around too many labs and other locations to ever say that. The risk is quite low, and the reason I say that is because this is high explosives with plutonium in a containment vessel that's about 6 feet across. It looks like, if you think about the old-fashioned diving helmets, it kind of looks like that. They're round and have these windows, circular windows, where different instruments can measure what's happening inside. But the key thing is, it's not just a containment vessel, it's also the disposal vessel. So they don't, after the experiment takes place, they don't open it, they don't transfer the material into another package. They don't even bring it above ground. So the facility in Nevada is designed not only to house the experiments and all the equipment to do the experiment, but it's where the material is actually emplaced afterward, and all of the regulatory process for the state and nationally takes that into account. So it's a pretty low risk activity from a contamination perspective, and that's of course due to a lot of the focus and attention of the people of Nevada, dealing with the nuclear testing legacy.
Thank you. Let me join three questions that get into politics and bureaucratics as well. And they're about what is the impetus for this interest in resumption of testing. One question is, since the president seemed to be talking about delivery vehicle testing, the Russian testing of exotic weapons seemed to be what sparked his initial posting. Can we focus on that instead and hope that that's what he meant? Second, I've got a good question from a PhD, William Faulkner at one of my favorite places, the University of Sussex, who asks, again, given that the initial post was confused, and given that this president does not always have a long attention span, is it perhaps better to just sit down, not make a fuss, and hope that everybody forgets about his idea? And then a more direct question from Oregon Peaceworks. What's the real reason that the administration is talking about this? Who profits? In whose interest is this? Any of the three of you who would like to start on those interrelated questions?
I can take a stab to begin. The one question is, why did President Trump say this 2 hours before he met with Xi Jinping, 3 weeks ago? It is my considered judgment that, one senator, Senator Tom Cotton of Arkansas, was able to reach him and suggest that, as I mentioned before, there was an assessment in 2019 that Russia, maybe China, are engaged in activities inconsistent with the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. That is probably what triggered President Trump. I do not think that President Trump was confused about, nuclear explosive testing and missile testing. I think that is where this is coming from. And yes, the president was not clear whatsoever, but I think that's what triggered things. Will this go away? I wish this would go away. I would like to have a nice holiday weekend and cook dinner with my family. But I think that it's quite clear, as Corey said, there have been discussions about this. The agencies have been tasked with coming up with suggestions about how to put some, how shall we say, credibility into the president's rather vague words. I hope that they will agree and the president will understand that Energy Secretary Chris Wright's comments from a few days after the president's initial remarks were the right answer, which is that the United States is already engaged in a very robust, very expensive program of delivery system flight testing, stockpile stewardship, subcritical nuclear experiments. We're spending $20 billion on the stockpile stewardship program this coming year. That is more than sufficient to maintain the reliability of the U.S. arsenal, and doing something like resuming nuclear testing is only going to open the door to others to advance their capabilities. So that's my quick answer.
Okay. Corey, Representative Titus, anything to add on those? I'm always interested in the question of who benefits.
Yeah,
Go
please,
ahead.
Representative Tice. Well, I was only going to answer one other small piece, which is, will this go away? And should we just ignore it, assuming that his attention will move on to something else? And while I'm sympathetic to that, agreeing with Daryl, this has not been a fun or positive debate to be in over the last few weeks. I actually think it is important that we push back when the president makes statements like this. I don't think I think that there is damage from off the cuff statements that are not well, kind of well founded. I think there's damage if we let them go by. The next time it comes up, it's, well, nobody objected, or I didn't understand the problem. So, when we're dealing with things as important as nuclear weapons and as consequential as these statements, it's not comfortable, but I do think it's our responsibility to put good information out there and to make sure, especially on these issues that cross technical and political kind of boundaries, that we make sure that if a political statement or a political decision is being made, that it's clear that that's what it is, and not let kind of the narrative create a technical justification that's not there.
Thank you.
Yeah, I agree with Corey. Some things you don't want to give legs to, so you don't address it in that news cycle. But something as important as beginning nuclear testing, I think you have to just take it head on. You have to fight it. You have to stop it. You have to keep it from spreading. And already other countries have made adjustments and started taking actions in response. So if we just ignore it, especially under this president, we don't know where it's going to go. A question about why don't we forget about nuclear testing and just look at testing delivery systems. We can already do that. So that's not an issue that we have to worry about. Also, I'm pretty cynical. I always say follow the money if you want to know who benefits besides the whole planet and everybody's health. Follow the money and who's going to be investing in this whole new testing program. And I agree with Daryl that President Trump heard this, that China's going to be doing something and Putin's doing something, North Korea's doing something. We got to do something. It's a question of my mushroom cloud is bigger than your mushroom cloud. And I believe that's how he thinks. And that's exactly part of the motivation.
One quick
Thanks very much.
addition, Tom. The world has spoken actually very shortly after President Trump's initial comments. I just wanted to make sure everybody understands. Each year, the UN First Committee votes on resolutions on different issues. There's an annual resolution on the test ban and the moratorium. On October 31, just the day after President Trump's comments, there was a vote. This year, the United States was the only country that voted no on this resolution for the first time in history. Even North Korea voted yes. So the world has spoken. And so if the United States takes a wrong turn and resumes nuclear testing, I mean, we qualify for nuclear weapon rogue state status. And that is not where we want to be.
Thank you. And we'll come back to a couple of questions about CTBT and CTBTO. Good questions are still pouring in. We're near the end of the hour. We'll go a few minutes past the hour. First, there's an important announcement for fans of cinema in the audience. Another reason I wish I were a constituent of Representative Titus. The Uranium Film Festival opens today in Las Vegas on the topics that we have discussed here. 3-day event. And then we also have a very welcome note from, one moment, William Burns wanted us to recall that the same topic that Dina Titus has worked on for so many years has been covered in good films about radiation effects on downwinders, films such as First We Bombed New Mexico, also Paul Jacobs and the Nuclear Gang, and Nuclear Savage Secret Project 4.1. I want to turn to the issue that Daryl raised just a moment ago, which is about support for the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty and the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty Organization, based in Vienna, which has built an international monitoring system that is capable of detecting nuclear explosions of wherever they occur. And I have some concern about continued United States support. The vote that Daryl mentioned in the first committee of the UN General Assembly, I think, was a cover your ass kind of decision by the US delegation. The president just said something about testing, so it's safer to vote no on this. That does not quite concern me as much as the point that Representative Titus already referred to, that the Heritage Foundation, which has incredible influence in this administration, has made clear its opposition to funding the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty Organization. And as our colleague Tariq Rauf points out in the questions, these are actions that could undermine not only the Test Ban Treaty, the test moratorium, but the Non-Proliferation Treaty itself. And he asks, what voices can influence the president to recognize the vital U.S. national interests at stake here. So again, I'll turn to any of the three of you either to answer the specific question or to comment. Corey, please.
Yeah, I would just like to make one comment about the short-sightedness of withdrawing funding from the CTBTO. It's actually a really important question, and it would be easy to say, look, we have signed the treaty, but we haven't ratified, and for a long time there's been no indication that we're on the verge of ratification. Why are we supporting this organization? And that's been asked and answered by multiple administrations and by both parties in the United States. We have continued to fund the CTBTO because we see it in our interest. And the really important piece there is that we actually, as do all members of the treaty, gain a lot of information about what's happening around the world. When the North Koreans have tested, we all have been able to get information about those tests in a timely way because the international monitoring system of the CTBT is detecting it through seismic, radionuclide, infrasound, hydroacoustic sensors that are distributed across the world. I know there was a comment in the Q&A that I shouldn't emphasize U.S. advantage in this case, and I understand that. I think that the CTBT and the global testing moratorium is a shared advantage to a lot of countries. And the IMS, the International Monitoring System of the CTBTO, is a perfect example of that. But the fact of the matter is, for the United States, we don't spend money on a lot of things because we know the CTBTO, through our small investment, leverages a greater capability that, frankly, we might have to think about duplicating if it didn't exist. AFTAC, the Air Force Technical Applications Center, the intelligence community, not through secret means, but through the flow of data that we get, just as every other state does. We don't have to do things to gather that data because it's coming from that direction. And it's benefited us in ways that go way beyond nuclear testing, even though its core mission is nuclear testing, and it's demonstrated itself as being highly, highly capable. But even things like the volcano off the coast of Tonga, we knew about that as a massive environmental activity because of how it was detected by the CTBTO sensors. So we get a lot out of it, and I think it would be short-sighted to withdraw funding that would undermine that capability.
Thank you. Representative Titus, unlike some of us, you have a lot of other things to do today. And I wonder if you want to make comments on these or on any other topics before we let you get on with the day.
Thank you. No, I think this is very important, and I appreciate being part of it. Just getting kind of related, that back during the shutdown, the scientists who were involved in this, and many of them stationed at the Nevada test site, were laid off. Always in the past, they've been considered essential, and yet they were gone. And so if you had a situation where you needed monitoring or needed involvement or needed some information, whether it's for the weather or for somebody else's detonation, those people just weren't there. And to do that, I think, was a big mistake, that they are essential. And I just looked up a couple of things I wanted to add to Mr. Burns' list of movies to recommend to see: Blue Skies, Desert Bloom, and The Incredible Shrinking Man. If you can find it, you should watch it. It's somebody who got exposed to radiation.
Okay. I was afraid you were going to go back to my youth in the 1950s and the movie Them, where radioactive explosions caused giant ants to run wild over Las Vegas. But
well, there's a lot of theory that all those sci-fi movies kind of came out of the fear of living in the shadow of the mushroom cloud, and that was one of the ways we adapted to it. It's like whistling in the dark. So that's a good. I'll add that to my list.
It's not a cinema classic, but it fits the theme. Thank you very much, Congresswoman Titus, for joining us today. I'm going to wrap this up. I appreciate all the interest of more than 100 people who attended this. It will be available to view again on our website as quickly as we can turn it around by Monday, I suppose, Daryl. And let me thank also Corey Hinderstein, Daryl, and his incredibly talented staff at the Arms Control Association. Thank you. God bless you all. Good weekend.